Hello and welcome to It's About Time. I'm your host Caleb Carter, and if you watched our last episode, one thing that I said was that HBCUs are full of hidden jewels, and today we get to talk to another one of those hidden jewels in the person of my professor, Dr. Derek Blackwell. But we'll get to that after this commercial break. Stay tuned. This is It's About Time. Hello and welcome back to It's About Time. And joining me today, we have my media literacy professor, Dr. Derek Blackwell. Thank you, Dr. Blackwell, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, Doc, I wanted to start with this because I always like to open up and give whoever's on their flowers for what they've done here on campus. And I can say that for you because I had the chance to go to USC recently, and one person that I got to meet was Tony Hall. She's a former alumni of PVMU. She went to graduate school at USC, and one thing that she said was that, although when she was here, the comm department wasn't what it is now. One name that she said was Dr. Derek Blackwell. He was responsible for enriching the program and building it up to what it is now. And I can agree with that. I mean, being in your classes has been one of the better experiences. I My other professors may not like when I say this, but I say you're my favorite professor because it's always an engaging time when I'm in your class. I know that I'm always going to be taught well, and I'm always going to have a good time while being taught. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, and I want to give you your flowers while you can smell
I appreciate that, man. I work hard to try to put forth something of quality, and so when it's appreciated, it makes me feel like I'm doing something worthwhile. So yeah, thank
No,
you.
I definitely can say that, and I know I'm not the only student who would say that. I know that for sure. But Dr. Blackwell, I wanted to start with this, um, because I know you're from a small town, Beeville, Texas, formerly out of Victoria.
Yeah.
But how do we get here? How do we end up being a professor here at PV?
I mean, it's kind of a long story because I actually didn't want to go to college. Like when I
Mm-hmm.
was a high school student, I wasn't really interested in college, and it's not because I was against it or anti-college, but I just didn't really have like a circle of people around me who were aspiring toward those kind of things. My parents are not college graduates. And the friends that I had, we kind of had small town sorts of visions, I guess, in terms of what we wanted to do. So it really wasn't until I was in college and I was kind of at the end of college when
Okay.
I started to kind of develop the goals toward what I'm doing now. And it was in large part because of a professor
Right.
whose class I liked, who I think I would describe in similar ways to what you were saying about me in terms of like, I knew I was learning stuff, I was being pushed, my eyes were opened in interesting ways. And so, I kind of saw him at the front of the classroom and saw something that I thought I could maybe do. I didn't know anybody who had done that sort of thing other than
Right.
the professors that I had just like sat in class with. And
Mhm.
so like I emailed him and asked him if he would be willing to kind of tell me a little bit about how you become a college professor. And
Okay.
he invited me to his office to meet with him. and told me about what I would need to do and offered help with, applying to grad school and stuff like that. And so I really value it because I only took one class with him and it was a summer class, so it was short, but he opened up a world for me in a way that I think, nobody else could have really done.
Right.
Nobody else I knew anyway. And so now that I'm here and have the opportunity to do that for other people, I try to do it to the best of my ability, because I know a lot of the people that I work with, students who are here, are coming from a similar background to me. They don't have a bunch of people in their lives who went to college or grad school or, are doing this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Right. And I'm going to keep saying this, but for the people at home watching, if there was ever a reason why you send your child to a HBCU, Dr. Blackwell is a shining example of why you send your child here. Because Dr. Blackwell, before I came to PV, my parents told me, they said, one thing about HBCUs is that the professors, they'll take care of you. And I didn't know what that meant, being young. But when I got here, I feel like you being one of those professors, I can finally understand why that is. But Dr. Blackwell, one thing that was interesting about your story just now is that, you didn't want to go to college to begin with, you much less become a college professor.
Right.
And you've been pretty transparent in our class about how, you weren't the most vocal kid in class. You almost consider yourself an introvert. So how does that person who may have been in the back of the class, right, how does he become the great professor that we see now?
I mean, I was literally at the back of the class of the professor that I was telling you about. Like, I sat in the back and I didn't talk, but I emailed him and he, I guess he had like read my work when I turned in assignments and stuff like that and saw enough in me to be willing to kind of share. But I mean, it's true. My personality is such that I'm not like an outgoing person. I'm not a super social person. I'm a lot more of a thinker than a talker.
Right.
And I guess that's probably why like being a professor kind of works for me, because there are periods when, of course, I've got to do a lot of talking, but there's like 10 times more thinking that happens before the talking.
Right.
And so like by the time I get up to the front of the room, I've thought about this stuff a lot. And so I can speak with confidence about it most of the time, which feels very different to me than like being like at a party or a social situation and somebody comes up to you and you're just making like small talk. I'm really not interested in small talk.
Right,
I'm interested in like deep talk or like thoughtful talk. And so teaching is a lot of thoughtful talk. And I like discussion-oriented classes because it allows me to talk less and to listen and to kind of facilitate a conversation with people. Because really, my goal is not to pass along a bunch of wisdom of my own so much as it is to kind of get students to like think about things in new and different ways. And so if I can ask the right question that gets people thinking and talking, that to me is like the peak of like a good class, is that sort of thing.
Right. And I'm more than grateful that you like deep talk, because that's what I try to do here on this show.
Okay.
But for the class that you teach of mine, which is media literacy, right? And you talked about being knowledgeable about certain subjects, and media literacy is one of those subjects where we hear about it a lot, but we may not understand the concept of what it truly means. So talk a little bit about that, about what it means to be media literate.
Sure. I mean, basically, media literacy is about critical thinking, and specifically critical thinking about media, right? So all of us spend a large portion of our day interacting with media, whether it's social media or television or movies. There's so many ways that we're engaging with different kinds of media. But so much of that happens in a way that is not thoughtful. It's like I consume it, it makes me laugh, or it distracts me, or maybe it informs me about certain things. But we oftentimes don't go past the surface to thinking about like what it's doing to me, what it's doing to the people around me, and even things about like where these messages come from and why they're created the ways that they are. And so part of what I'm interested in is kind of getting students, whether you're a comm major or some other major, to just think about this stuff a little bit more deeply, because I think it can help us to guard ourselves and protect ourselves from some of the negatives that can
Right.
come from this stuff, but also to maximize the positives of our experiences with media. You know, we're in a world where like it's easy to be deceived and to be sucked
Definitely.
into a lot of false information. And
Mhm.
so part of media literacy is being able to like look at sources and think about where things come from and are they accurate. But also a lot of how we see ourselves and how we see other people is influenced by things we've seen in the media. So yeah.
And one thing I like about this class in particular is that, I mean, of course, I'm an aspiring journalist, so this helped me in the real world. I mean, and you know, people joke about it all the time. You know, when we will use y equals mx plus b in the real world, but your class, it has its practical applications even for people who are not, you know, going into our career field. And before we go to commercial break, Doctor, I want to get to this because one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on is because we had a conversation in class about hip hop and violence and how those two things correlate. But before we get to the violence aspect of it, it's pretty obvious to me that you're a big hip hop fan. So talk a little bit about that and what is it about hip hop that catches your eye?
I mean, I grew up on it for one, and so it's just a part of, in a lot of ways, it's a part of my identity, and I think that's true of like a lot of the people on this campus, both students and now a lot of professors. You know, the music you grow up on and the culture you grow up kind of embedded in, it shapes how you see everything. And so I see hip hop in almost everything, and even classes that have nothing to do with it. I oftentimes can work a hip hop example into it because it's how my mind works, right? In terms of like what appeals to me about it now, I mean, I think I'm just somebody who really like appreciates creativity. And I think I'm creative in some ways, but not in the ways that artists are. And so hip hop to me is the genre and the culture where the most exciting creative ideas are happening. I mean, it's part of the reason that it's become the #1 genre from like a commercial standpoint is because it's where all the innovation is happening. Other genres are pulling from hip hop to kind of push their creative expression as well. And so that I think to me currently is like what draws me about it is that there's just so many different versions of it today that, you know, are just doing really interesting stuff. So
yeah, and you talk about growing up on hip hop. I mean, of course, me being younger, that has been basically my life. That's all I hear on the radio. I mean, that's a good portion of what I listen to now is hip hop, and it's almost seeing what's happening in the news related to hip hop. It can almost be kind of saddening, you know, in the way that hip hop has kind of taken a turn for the worse. But we're gonna get to that and how some of that turn isn't to blame on hip hop itself, but the factors that go into it. And Dr. Blackwell, I'm really enjoying this conversation. But we're gonna go to commercial break after this. Stay tuned. It's about time. Hello and welcome back to It's About Time. Joining me again, we have Dr. Derek Blackwell, my media literacy professor. And Dr. Blackwell, before the break, we talked about how hip hop and how you find ways to weave it in just because you're such a big fan of it. But another thing about hip hop is that it's an autobiographical genre, right? Most of what we hear in hip hop is what these rappers have lived, what they have seen, what they have done. So talk a little bit about that and how that kind of helps enhance some of the storytelling that you do in class.
I mean, I think that, as an art form, hip hop comes out of Black and Brown communities, and it's artists talking about their experiences. Um, some are true, some are an exaggeration of the
Right.
truth, some are
Definitely.
probably largely fictional, right? But I think the goal is to at least come across as autobiographical and to be able to resonate with, a certain audience. And so I think that part of what draws students and fans in general to this stuff is that it's speaking our language for one, and talking about things that are familiar. And so I think that in a lot of ways what hip hop can do is like unite a room, right? The same way that a DJ can put a song on and like bring a whole dance floor together. I can throw a certain thing up on the slide and the whole classroom is like, like it does a version of the same thing, right? And so I think that it's part of why I try to use it is that, I know what it's like to be a student, and I know that sometimes there are things that are interesting to me that are not going to be interesting to you. And so the same way that a DJ might curate a set and say, okay, I need this song that's going to get the floor moving. I need this song that's going to, be the slow jam. I need to kind of have some pacing and some balance.
Kind of helps bridge that gap.
Right. And so you find ways to kind of build an experience, build a moment with the students. And so sometimes what that involves is, okay, let me find this that's going to kind of bring everybody back in, because everybody has something to say if I bring up certain names or if I bring up certain works. And so, yeah.
Right. Hip hop definitely helps bridge that gap. And I've seen that in our class. I mean, I think during that time when we were talking about hip hop, you would start the class with, say, a Kendrick Lamar song or different songs, kind of just to get people in the mood of what we were going into. But one thing that comes to mind when I think about that time in our class, Dr. Blackwell, is that it's interesting the way that the world works. And I say that to say this. I want to say it was about a month ago that we had talked about hip hop and violence. A week after that, I asked you to come on the show, and tragically, PNB Rock was murdered in Los Angeles. That the week following that week, I took a camera out and I took it around campus asking students how did they feel about the PNB Rock murder, and also about how did they feel about violence in hip hop and how we could possibly combat that, right? And I want to show that video now. So we're gonna throw it over to that video where we talk about violence in hip hop and what the students of PVAMU had to say about it.
Man, I think something can be done about it. I think really what it is hip hop is a mirror of society. You know what I'm saying? And we live in a violent world, so a lot of what you see in hip hop music and even other genres of music is really just kind of mimicking or just copying what is out there in the world. You know, I think hip hop music, initially started to be as a alternative to street life. It was like people used to do hip hop and be part of hip hop groups so that they wouldn't have to be part of gangs and things like that. And so I think what it has to be is a real look back at the roots of hip hop and really what the whole purpose was. And it was about peace, love, unity, and having fun. And we just have to get back to the roots of that and acknowledge where things kind of went wayward at. And I think that's the beginning of a solution.
I definitely feel like something can be done about it. I feel like with rappers, if they rap about something other than violence, I feel like plays a part in the, like, for example, Lil Baby, like how he came out with The Bigger Picture, and he talked about like the George Floyd incident, and it's like in that moment, even though he is somebody that's like from the streets and he's from the hood or whatever, that's not all that he's like publicized, and that's not all that he's like rapping about. So I feel like if they like expand their horizon, I feel like that can play a, because they're basically rappers are mimicking what they're seeing in the streets. But since rappers are so influential, I feel like if they rap about something other than violence, that can play a part in the actual culture. I feel like something can definitely be done. But like you said, like it's become the norm with hip hop culture. You know, like when I think about violence in hip hop, I think about, you know, Suge Knight and Tupac. I think about Eazy-E. I think about all those people who had passed away before, like people who are dying now, and it's definitely become the norm. You know, black on black crime, we're killing each other. But there's something that can be done about it. You just have to figure out how to do it and execute it right.
Honestly, it's the rap industry is one big game, right? And the objective of the game is to win. You know, blow up. You know, make trendy music, go win Grammys and all that. But part of the game comes some negative stuff. And it's like, you know, when you have money and fame, people, you know, what they see on the internet, they may think you have a whole bunch of money, or in P&B's case, you know, they might want to take your chain or whatever the case may be. That's just what comes with it, you know? So I feel like there is something we probably can do about it to ease it. But as far as stopping it and ceasing it, that's just a part of it.
What we just heard from the students of PVMU, what was their opinion of kind of if they thought violence was just a part of the hip hop culture, or whether they thought something could be done about it. And that brought me back to, again, our classroom discussion. And one of the discussions we had was, and you can tell me if I'm telling this story right, so I can break it down for the audience. Yeah. Was that we were given an excerpt from a book written by a lady named Trisha Rose, where she talked about, does hip hop cause violence? And her argument was that, you know, hip hop itself is not to blame. It's more on, you know, things like chronic joblessness, you know, homelessness, drugs in the black community. Those are the real culprits for violence in hip hop. But at the same token, you gave us a video where the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, he was presented with a challenge, right? Because a rapper in his city was just murdered because of violence. But what he said was that, you know, we need to take these gun brandishing, drug using videos off of, we need to deplatform them, so to speak, take them off of YouTube, take them off of social media, because that isn't what our children need to see. And you asked us, where did we land on that spectrum? You know, did we side with Trisha Rose, where it's like, you know, the music isn't to blame, there are actually problems that need to be solved? Or with Mayor Eric Adams, where he says, you know, the problem is in front of our eyes, we just need to take care of it. And it was kind of up for debate in our class, but one thing I don't remember getting was your answer to that question. So I guess I want to ask that to you. Who do you more side with, Ms. Trisha Rose or Mayor Eric Adams?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I chose those examples and the questions that I asked you all with the goal of really getting you to think, right? It wasn't so much that I wanted you to think this person's right or this person's right, but just to kind of think deeply enough to be able to kind of articulate a perspective. And I think that for me, obviously I have a certain bias because, one, I'm a professor like Trisha Rose,
right,
and two, I've read the rest of the book, right?
Okay.
So part of what I would say is that the argument that Trisha Rose lays out is much more along the lines of how I think about the issue, because it acknowledges the complexities of it, right? Mm-hmm. So what often happens when you have a social problem that has some connection to some form of media, whether it's hip hop music or violent video games or whatever else, is the easy thing to do is to say it's that thing's fault, right? And that thing is an impersonal sort of entity, right? Hip hop. It's not traceable to a single person. It's kind of this elusive thing to try to pin down. what Trisha Rose says is that that's oversimplifying it, right?
Right.
Ultimately, there are lots of social factors involved, and you've named off some of them, right? And I think that essentially it's these communities that hip hop comes out of and continues to thrive in are communities that often are plagued with like desperate sorts of conditions, right?
Right.
And when you put somebody in a position where they're desperate and trying to survive, you often bring out the worst in them, right? I mean, that's true of anybody, right? You
Right.
get hungry enough and you start to get, you know,
Right. You start looking
a little,
for food.
little testy,
Right.
right? I mean, like the way you interact with people changes. And so desperation brings those things out. And the desperate conditions that Rose is describing aren't just coincidental, right? It's not just a coincidence that there are large concentrated Black communities in the middle of these impoverished environments. It's strategic, right? I mean, if you look at the history of the country. And so that's a much more uncomfortable thing to confront, but I think it's important to recognize it. And so what Rose says is, no, it's not that rappers are blameless. It's not that hip hop has no responsibility, but to put it all in that one, to put all of that energy towards them specifically ignores people who actually have a lot more power than rappers who can do something about it, like these politicians and people who are in charge of these systems.
Right, and I think you're exactly right. And Doc, first of all, I would just want to, as a quick aside, it's all I'm calling you Doc. I'm so used to calling you Professor, but Professor Blackwell, you're absolutely right. And I had the opportunity to interview and sit down with Kevin Powell. You know, he's a writer / activist. And one thing that he said about this kind of same question was that when we ask the question of, you know, what can be done about violence in hip hop, that's looking at the symptom. But we should look at the actual problem is what can be done about violence in America, right? And I feel like you were kind of speaking to that, because when we talk about all of these other problems, drugs, joblessness, homelessness, things of that nature, that is, in his words, a form of violence against our community, about how we are underserved and kind of hung out to dry in that aspect. But Dr. Blackwell, I really thought this was a productive conversation. You mentioned that you like having deep talks, so I hope I provided that for you today. And thank you again for joining us.
No, I enjoyed it. Thank you for your questions. It's good.
Of course. And that has been another episode of It's About Time. This was Professor Dr. Blackwell, and I'm your host, Caleb Carter. Thanks for watching.